They ripped her dignity from 30,000 feet without even touching her, just a cold stare, a smug voice, and a seat stolen by a man who decided a black woman didn't belong in first class. No warning, no reason, just a silent agreement between crew and passenger that her skin made her unworthy. She was forced to stand, belly full with pregnancy, while strangers pretended not to see. A drink was spilled on her. She wasn't offered napkins. She was offered silence. Every second of that flight dragged her lower, until the world thought she was nobody. But buried beneath the quiet was a truth no one on that plane could imagine. A truth powerful enough to bring billion-dollar deals crashing down before the wheels even touch the ground. This is not just about injustice. It's about what happens when the world underestimates the wrong woman. If that opening grabbed you, like this video, subscribe for the full series, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what part of this moment hit you hardest? Delaney Rucker moved slowly as she stepped into the jet bridge, her body heavy with a final trimester of pregnancy and the weight of expectation. She wore simple flats, a long cotton maxi dress clinging slightly from the summer humidity, and a canvas tote she refused to check because it carried everything that mattered. Medical files, granola bars, headphones, and a worn-out paperback she'd read 3 times already. She reached the door of the aircraft and paused, forcing a smile as the flight attendant greeted her and gestured down the first-class aisle. She nodded, soft-spoken, and followed the polished path toward 2A. For once, she had chosen something for herself, something extra, something earned. After all the stress of solo doctor visits, work deadlines, and the unease of knowing she would bring her child into the world on her own, this flight was her pause. A window seat in first class. She had imagined it all week, the quiet, the space, the calm, and the view. She imagined sipping juice with a napkin folded neatly beside her, feet up, head back, headphones in. She imagined she would finally feel like she belonged somewhere she normally didn't. That illusion cracked the moment she made eye contact with the man in 2B. Preston Vance, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, mid-50s, was already seated, legs spread, fingers moving over his phone as if he were writing something urgent and powerful. His navy suit looked custom-fitted. Gold cufflinks winked under the cabin lights. The way his jaw tightened when he looked up at her said everything. He didn't expect her. He didn't want her. He didn't think she should be there. Delaney paused beside the seat, offered the polite half-smile reserved for strangers in shared spaces. He didn't return it. He shifted slightly, made a point of spreading his coat over the shared armrest between them, and turned back to his phone. She glanced at her boarding pass. 2A, this was her seat. With a quiet exhale, she stepped forward and reached for the coat, gently lifting the sleeve to make room for herself. Preston's head snapped up again. His brow creased. His nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but his stare lingered, sharp, silent, and cold. A flight attendant noticed. She approached, her heels silent on the carpet. Her hair was pinned tightly at the nape of her neck, not a single strand out of place. She bent slightly toward Preston, not Delaney. She asked softly if there was a problem. He answered in a low tone Delaney couldn't hear. The attendant straightened, gave Delaney a glance that felt more clinical than curious, and asked to see her boarding pass. Delaney blinked, confused, then handed it over. The attendant nodded and disappeared toward the front of the cabin. Delaney stood in the aisle, her hand still on her bag, belly shifting slightly as her weight settled. She could feel the glances now. They came in short flickers, from the man across the aisle pretending to read a newspaper, the woman adjusting her bracelet and looking too long at Delaney's sandals, even the teenager in row 3 who nudged her mother and tilted her chin toward the pregnant woman standing still. Her stomach tightened, not from the baby, but from something colder. When the attendant returned, she wore a tighter smile, the kind that barely reached her cheeks. There had been a small mix-up, she said. A glitch in the reservation system. They were terribly sorry. If Ms. Rucker didn't mind, they'd just need her to move seats temporarily, just until things could be sorted. She would still receive first-class service. She would be moved to a seat in the forward cabin, they said. It would be fine, just a small inconvenience. Delaney nodded slowly, hesitant, but trying not to cause a scene. Her fingers trembled slightly as she collected her bag and began the slow walk down the aisle. The walk felt endless. Each step echoed the growing humiliation in her chest. First-class passengers followed her with their eyes, not with concern, but with judgment. They examined her back, her dress, her bag, her very presence. She passed row after row, the sound of her own breath loud in her ears. No one said a word. She reached her new seat. It wasn't in the forward cabin. It was the last row before the lavatories. The seat vibrated slightly from the engine noise. The armrest on one side was broken. The air smelled like chemical cleaner and stale food. She lowered herself into the seat with difficulty, pulling her bag between her knees. She adjusted her dress. She stared forward. The attendants continued their pre-flight checks. No one came back to explain anything further. She sat there, silent, barely moving. A child a few rows ahead was crying. Someone sneezed behind her. She felt pressed in, swallowed by the volume, the bodies, the closeness. This wasn't a temporary error. This was erasure. The woman next to her gave a tight smile and turned toward the window. Delaney placed one hand on her stomach. The baby shifted gently under her palm. She felt the sting in her throat rise, but she swallowed it down. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had not imagined starting her journey this way, nor ending it in the forgotten shadows of a commercial flight, seated next to a stranger who had not spoken since she arrived. He had barely looked at her, only offering the barest turn of his body toward the window, pulling his elbow inward like her presence demanded he protect his personal space. A flight attendant passed once more, this one younger than the first, her expression practiced and distracted. She didn't stop to ask Delaney if she needed anything. She didn't check to see if her seatbelt fit properly or if she was comfortable, though Delaney's belly clearly pressed against the lap restraint in a way that made breathing difficult. Delaney inhaled quietly and exhaled even slower, forcing herself not to cry. Not here. Not now. Her baby shifted again, and she laid a hand over her stomach to calm both of them. Just as she closed her eyes to collect herself, a murmur of voices caught her attention. It came from the aisle, just a few seats ahead. Two passengers were whispering, both white, both well-dressed. The woman glanced back toward Delaney's row, then said something barely audible to her companion. The man chuckled softly, covering his mouth in mock discretion. Delaney couldn't hear the words, but she didn't have to. She recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same look Preston had given her, the same dismissive glance she'd felt 1,000 times before in elevators, meetings, lobbies, and waiting rooms. The kind of look that didn't just say she didn't belong, but insisted she was a mistake. As the plane leveled into cruising altitude, the attendants began their service routine. Carts clinked, tray tables lowered, and the scent of reheated meals and synthetic butter filled the air. When the cart reached Delaney's row, the attendant paused. She glanced at the clipboard, then frowned. "Oh," she said softly, almost to herself, "we're short one." She looked between Delaney and the man beside her. Then, as if the choice were obvious, she extended the last meal tray to him. Delaney waited, expecting her to say she'd return shortly. She didn't. The attendant simply nodded and moved on. The man beside her unfolded his napkin and dug in without a word. She turned her face toward the seat back in front of her, lips pressed into a line, hunger turning slowly into shame. She had not eaten since early morning. She had counted on this meal not because she couldn't afford food, but because traveling alone while heavily pregnant had made preparation difficult. Still, she said nothing. She didn't call the attendant back. She didn't press the button above her. Something had settled in her bones, something that told her clearly what kind of flight this would be. One where her presence was treated as an inconvenience to be ignored, not a person to be served. The overhead lights dimmed after the meal service, leaving only the faint glow of reading lamps and screen flickers. A child somewhere cried, the sound distant and rhythmic. Delaney shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure on her back, her breath catching as a jolt of pain shot through her spine. She winced, adjusted again, and leaned forward slightly to stretch her legs in the narrow space. That's when it happened. The turbulence hit, brief, but enough to jostle the cart as it rolled back down the aisle. A small can of ginger ale perched on top tipped sideways and rolled off. It struck the armrest, bounced, and splashed directly into Delaney's lap. The cold, sticky liquid soaked through the front of her dress, spreading a dark stain over her belly and thighs. Gasps came from a few nearby passengers. The attendant pushing the cart hurried over, fumbling for napkins, murmuring a rushed apology. Delaney froze. She looked down at herself, at the wet fabric clinging to her skin, her body exposed in a way that made her want to disappear. The attendant handed her a few cocktail napkins, far too small to make any difference, and then quickly moved on without waiting to see if she was all right. The man beside her offered no reaction. He didn't shift, didn't speak. He continued scrolling through his phone. The laughter from earlier resumed somewhere behind her. She wiped at the stain with slow, deliberate movements, but it was no use. Her dress was ruined. Her thighs were cold. Her body trembled not from the temperature, but from the complete and brutal absence of kindness. She sat still for several minutes, trying to will the tears back down her throat, trying not to imagine how she must look from the outside, drenched, tired, big-bellied, and alone. And then she heard it. Preston Vance's voice again, louder this time, drifting from the front of the cabin with unmistakable arrogance. He was speaking to someone, perhaps another passenger or a flight attendant, laughing about how the flight had lowered its standards, about how certain people had no sense of place anymore. He didn't name her. He didn't have to. His voice carried backward, bouncing off the narrow walls like insult-shaped echoes. A few people laughed. Someone said something about social experiments. Delaney closed her eyes. The baby moved again. She pressed her hand gently to her stomach, as if to say she was sorry for the noise, the cold, the humiliation, the silence, the shame. She felt anger stir, but it was buried under too many layers of fatigue and restraint. Her shoulders sagged. Her body folded inward slightly, trying to shield itself from visibility, from the space she occupied that others resented. She realized that everything she had brought with her, the comfort of her careful planning, the confidence in her rightful place, had been stripped away one layer at a time. First by a stare, then by silence, then by quiet cruelty masked as oversight. But even silence, she had come to learn, could be violent when it was cold enough. Just when she thought the worst of the flight had passed, a sound from across the aisle pulled her attention. It was a laugh, not a joyous one, but sharp, nasal, and deliberately theatrical. A middle-aged man with graying temples and a Golf 10 leaned slightly toward his companion, a woman with platinum-dyed hair and diamond-studded nails, both of whom sat diagonally across from Delaney. The man was holding his phone, screen tilted slightly toward the aisle, but turned just enough that Delaney couldn't see it. His thumb swiped across the screen before he nudged the woman with his elbow and tilted the phone toward her. She leaned in, stifled a laugh behind her hand, and whispered something back. The man grinned and raised his voice just enough to be overheard. He said something about upgrades these days and how standards must have changed. The woman giggled in response and said something else, her voice dripping with sarcasm, about making first class accessible to everyone, even those who look like they just left a laundromat. Delaney's stomach twisted. She wasn't certain they were talking about her, but she didn't need certainty. The direction of their glances, the way the woman's eyes danced down to Delaney's lap, the little pause between their laughter and whispering. It all confirmed what she already knew. Her presence had become a joke. She had become the punchline of a private comedy being passed around the cabin like cheap gossip. Another passenger across the aisle, a teenage boy in a hoodie, glanced toward her, caught her eye for a fraction of a second, and then quickly looked away. His ears were red. He had heard, and now so had she. Delaney gripped the hem of her dress tightly in her fists. Her fingernails dug into the fabric as her eyes stung again with the threat of tears. But she refused to give in. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, focused on her breathing, and stared at the tray table in front of her, as if it were the only thing anchoring her sanity. She imagined herself somewhere else, anywhere else. But the weight of her reality always snapped her back. A loud yawn from behind her snapped her from her thoughts. She turned slightly to see the man seated diagonally behind her stretch his arms and comment to no one in particular that he hoped he wouldn't catch anything during the flight. He made a show of pulling out a travel-sized bottle of sanitizer, squeezing a large dollop into his palms and rubbing them together while casting a long look at Delaney. He sniffed the air, wrinkled his nose, and muttered something under his breath. She couldn't catch the words, but the disgust in his tone was loud enough. Delaney turned back forward, shoulders pulling tighter. It was a subtle chorus of insults now, woven into routine movements, hidden behind false politeness, and wrapped in plausible deniability. None of them had said her name. None of them had directly pointed fingers. But their behavior stung deeper than open hatred. It was the type of cruelty that thrived in comfort, protected by wealth, masked by smiles and casual conversation. It was the kind that didn't feel like violence to those delivering it, but broke the bones of the person receiving it. As the attendants moved down the aisle collecting trays and leftover trash, one of them paused at Delaney's row. The same young woman from earlier stood with a plastic bag in hand, eyes scanning the mess on Delaney's tray. The napkins were crumpled, soaked, and brown-stained. The small cup of water sat half-empty beside them. The attendant reached out with gloved hands, picked up the trash, and then, without meeting Delaney's eyes, sighed softly as if irritated, and turned away. Delaney wanted to speak. She wanted to say something, anything, to ask for fresh napkins, to request another cup of water, to explain that she hadn't spilled the drink herself. But her voice caught in her throat like gravel. She could feel the heat in her cheeks, the sting of shame lodged deep behind her ribs. And she couldn't find the words. Not now. Not anymore. Behind her, another laugh rang out, this one softer, more cruel in its subtlety. Someone had said something else. She heard the phrase pity seat. She heard the term public welfare. She heard the laughter that followed, and though the words weren't aimed directly at her, she could feel them burrow under her skin. It was like being slowly buried alive in 1,000 whispered judgments. She had spent her life navigating this kind of disdain, dodging it in the workplace, ignoring it in stores, swallowing it in medical waiting rooms. But she had not expected it here. Not on this plane. Not after spending money she had saved, planning every step of this trip, choosing her seat, booking it early, triple-checking every confirmation. Not after believing, however briefly, that she could be treated with the same respect as any other passenger. She placed her hands on her stomach again, trying to focus on the small movements inside her. The baby was quiet now, resting, perhaps. She envied that peace. She closed her eyes, let her chin dip toward her chest, and thought about the woman she had been before this flight. The stifled laughs. She shifted slightly, just enough to relieve the cramping behind her knees, but not enough to bump the man beside her. He hadn't moved in hours. Occasionally, he made a point of turning a page too loudly or sighing in annoyance when she adjusted her bag. She had learned to read these sounds, the passive signals people use to make their discomfort known without ever speaking aloud. It was just one more form of cruelty that lived in silence. When the seatbelt sign turned off again and the cabin lights brightened for the second round of service, Delaney sat up straighter. Her throat was dry. Her mouth tasted stale. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't been offered anything to drink since her small water cup was taken away during cleanup. Her stomach growled once, then again, followed by a quiet hiccup of discomfort that made her wince. She reached up slowly and pressed the service button above her. A soft ding echoed above her row. She waited. A few moments passed. Then several more. She kept her hand on her belly as the baby stirred lightly, a gentle roll inside her that made her wish she were anywhere else. She looked down the aisle and spotted one of the attendants checking on passengers 3 rows ahead. Her button remained lit. No one came. When the attendant finally approached her row, Delaney lifted her hand slightly and cleared her throat softly. She asked, politely, if she could have a glass of water. Just water, nothing else. The attendant barely glanced at her. She looked tired and distracted, But her response wasn't the kind of tired reserved for long workdays. It was the detached weariness of someone who had already decided Delaney was a problem to be managed, not a person to be served. The woman nodded once, tight-lipped, and walked away without speaking. Minutes passed, then more. Delaney glanced back at the galley, hoping to catch the attendant's eye again, but the woman was laughing now with another crew member. Not loudly, but loud enough. Delaney felt the pit in her stomach grow. She kept waiting. Another flight attendant came by to collect trash. He didn't stop at her row. She wanted to say something, but her voice had started to feel foreign in her own mouth. She realized she had barely spoken in hours. When the woman finally returned, she didn't bring water. Instead, she held a tightly wrapped snack box, the kind offered in premium cabins as a courtesy. She looked down at Delaney and raised a brow as if reconsidering the delivery. Then, with a flat tone, she said they had extras and were offering them to passengers further back. Delaney reached for the box, grateful for something, anything. But as her hand touched the corner, the attendant paused. She pulled it back slightly and asked if Delaney could confirm her seat number. Delaney blinked, confused, then repeated it softly. The attendant hesitated again, then handed the box over with visible reluctance. Her fingers lingered on the cardboard for a second too long, as if part of her wanted to take it back. Delaney held the box in her lap. She waited until the woman walked away before opening it. Inside were crackers, cheese spread, and a cookie. Not a meal, but enough to ease the ache. She had taken 2 bites before someone across the aisle commented about handouts making people feel entitled. Another passenger laughed. A voice added that if you give something away once, they always expect more. Delaney stopped chewing. Her jaw tensed. She closed the box without finishing it and tucked it into her bag. The food felt heavy now, not in weight, but in consequence. It was no longer a gift. It was another mark against her. Another perceived overstep. She had asked for water. She had accepted a snack. And somehow, in doing so, she had fed the fire that made her the target of every backward glance and whispered joke. She pulled her sweater tighter around herself, hiding the dried stain on her dress and the rising anger behind her ribs. The flight attendant passed again and looked at her with surprise, as if expecting her to have already eaten more. Delaney nodded once in silent acknowledgement and turned her eyes back toward the seat ahead. Not long after, the woman from earlier, the one with platinum hair and diamonds, stood from her seat and walked slowly down the aisle. She stopped beside Delaney's row, turned slightly, and reached into the overhead bin as if retrieving something. Her perfume left a trail of expensive citrus. She glanced down, looked Delaney over from hair to shoes, and smirked faintly before returning to her seat. Her body language said everything. You don't belong here. You know it. We all know it. Delaney's hands curled into fists in her lap. Her shoulders were tight. Her neck ached. Her mind ran in circles, trapped in the same question she had asked herself since the plane took off. How had this happened? Not the sequence of events. Those were easy to trace. Preston's eyes, the coat, the silence, the smileless attendant, the false mix-up, the walk, the spill, the glances, the laughter, the hunger, the water. But the question behind it all, the one that wrapped around her like ice, was why had none of them seen her as someone worth defending, worth acknowledging, worth basic decency? She wasn't yelling. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't doing anything but existing. But that, apparently, was the problem. Existing in a space where they didn't want her. Existing without apology. Existing while black, pregnant, and unafraid to sit in first class with her back straight and her eyes calm. Her lower back screamed for relief. Her legs tingled from poor circulation, and the dried soda crust on her dress had begun to stiffen against her thighs in patches that itched with every tiny shift. She remained quiet. She remained still. She remained small, as she had been forced to remain for the past several hours. Her mind replayed the progression of events in a loop she could not stop. Each slight, each pause, each narrowed glance, each smirk, each withheld basic courtesy. It layered over her like ash, until she could hardly remember the confident way she'd stepped onto the plane with her boarding pass in hand. That version of herself felt like a memory from another life, someone else entirely. Now, she existed only in this diminished version, an exhausted shadow in a seat that was never meant to hold her. A subtle shift in air pressure signaled someone moving up the aisle. Her eyes opened fully, her body instinctively tensing. She saw Preston Vance emerge from the shadows of first class, his silhouette broad, deliberate, self-assured. He wasn't heading toward the bathroom, which was to her left. No, he moved down the aisle with purpose, his expensive shoes thudding softly against the carpet. When he reached her row, he paused. Her heart ticked louder in her chest. He didn't look at her at first. He merely turned to check the space behind her, as if confirming something. Then he leaned toward the overhead bin just above her. There was nothing there for him. She knew it. But he used the motion as cover, and as he lowered himself closer to her row, he finally turned his face toward her. Their eyes met for the first time since she had been forced to surrender her seat. His lips curled upward in a grin that was neither kind nor civil. His eyes, blue and steady, raked across her face, then down to her stomach. He made no attempt to hide the disgust. Then came the words, quiet enough that no one else could hear them, but loud enough to land like a blow. He told her that standards had fallen. He said that charity had gone too far. And then he asked her, slowly, deliberately, if she felt proud of herself, sitting back here like she belonged. Delaney said nothing. She held his stare. She did not flinch, but her throat tightened, her fingers twitched, her skin burned beneath her sweater. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand, but she couldn't. Her body wouldn't allow it. She was too pregnant, too tired, too wounded. And worse, she knew that if she reacted, if she raised her voice or even raised a hand, she would be the one punished for it. The rules were never written in her favor. He knew that. That was the point. As if to prove it, he smirked again and made a comment about how she should be grateful to even be on the flight. Then, brushing past her without apology, he knocked her elbow deliberately with his forearm. Not hard enough to be called assault, just hard enough to humiliate. Her arm jolted into her belly. The baby stirred. She winced, clutched her side, and turned her face away, biting down hard on her lip to stop the tears. She felt them press against her eyelids, warm and full of fury, but she swallowed them like bitter medicine. Behind her, someone chuckled. It was not Preston. It was another passenger who had witnessed everything, seen the whole act play out, and decided that the moment was entertaining. That laugh, light and amused, broke something in Delaney. Her shoulders stiffened. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. She was humiliated, but she would not let them see her cry. Not now. Not after this. The flight attendant passed again shortly after, and for a moment Delaney thought she might finally be offered some kind of assistance. But instead, the woman leaned over and asked her to keep her arm inside the seat area to avoid blocking the aisle. Delaney blinked. The attendant had not said a word when Preston stood there hovering over her, practically lunging into her space. But now, with him gone, it was Delaney who received the warning. She mumbled an apology, tucked her arm closer to her side, and bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. The hour that followed passed in silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that throbbed with memory, with echoes, with unspoken curses and buried outrage. Delaney sat without moving, without eating, without sleeping. Her thoughts chased one another through a fog of exhaustion and pain. What was worse than being dismissed? Being publicly degraded and still expected to say thank you, still expected to smile, still expected to carry herself with grace so that the people who mocked her wouldn't feel uncomfortable about it. The rules were clear. She had to be polite. She had to be calm. She had to be invisible, even while being the target of everyone's focus. She was not allowed to fight back, not allowed to stand up, not allowed to reclaim her seat, her voice, or her pride. Every attempt would be twisted into evidence against her. Her presence was already treated as a threat. Her resistance would be labeled aggression. So she endured. 1 second at a time. As the plane began its gradual descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with weather updates and estimated landing times. The cabin lights came on. Passengers stirred. Delaney sat up straighter, her body aching with the stiffness of suppressed pain. Her belly felt heavier than it had earlier. She felt hollowed out, like the last flicker of pride inside her had been smothered under layers of mockery and silence. Her clothes, still damp in patches from the earlier spill, clung to her skin with a sticky coldness that made her stomach turn. Her muscles burned, her ankles were swollen, her head pounded with a slow, rhythmic ache that pulsed with her every heartbeat. She had not spoken in over an hour, her voice buried beneath the weight of every stare and smirk that had chipped at her sense of self. She sat in that narrow seat like a statue, arms wrapped protectively around her belly, her eyes locked on the back of the seat in front of her, as if she could disappear into its fabric. All around her, passengers were beginning to stir. Seat belts clicked into place. Bags shifted in overhead bins. Conversations returned in soft, caffeinated tones as people checked their watches, stretched, and prepared for landing. None of them looked her way. No one offered a glance, a word, or a shred of kindness. They had already decided what she was, an interloper, a disruption, a spectacle. And having had their fill of amusement at her expense, they now moved on, satisfied and undisturbed. The flight attendants walked the aisle for final checks. One past her row slowed slightly, then continued forward without saying a word. Delaney looked out past the aisle toward the slim opening between rows, and caught a glimpse of Preston Vance reclined comfortably in his rightful throne in first class. He sipped something from a crystal-clear glass, eyes closed, utterly at ease. He had erased her from his world entirely. She was no longer necessary. His final insult had been delivered, his power confirmed. The baby moved again, a slow turn beneath her ribs, and Delaney placed her palm over the motion, grounding herself in that one small proof of life, of purpose, of something that belonged to her alone. The captain's voice came through the intercom with a calm announcement about the weather in their destination city, a pleasant 68 degrees, a light breeze, clear skies. The tone was so cheery it felt cruel, a sharp contrast to the despair that wrapped itself around Delaney like a second skin. As the aircraft banked into its approach, the city lights twinkled in the distance, glowing like false promises. The wheels touched the runway with a sudden jolt. A few passengers gasped or chuckled. Some clapped. Delaney remained still. Her hands gripped the armrests not from fear, but from instinct, bracing herself against whatever final insult might still be waiting. The plane slowed, engines humming lower, brakes squealing slightly as it taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign pinged. Passengers sprang into motion, standing too quickly, digging through overhead compartments, nudging each other with hurried energy. Delaney stayed seated. She couldn't rise even if she wanted to. Her legs were stiff. Her back felt like it had been crushed. The swelling in her ankles was now visibly bulging above her shoes. Her fingers tingled from tension. But more than all of that, she stayed because she didn't want to move through that aisle again, didn't want to walk past all the people who had laughed at her, insulted her, dismissed her. She didn't want to face that corridor of contempt a second time. A voice spoke softly nearby, one of the flight attendants, asking passengers to allow those with special needs or mobility issues to disembark first. Delaney waited for someone to notice her. No one did. People continued reaching for bags, chatting about dinner reservations, hotel check-ins, missed connections. The woman with platinum hair stepped into the aisle and ran her fingers along her pearl necklace as she laughed with the man behind her. Another commented about the smell coming from the back. Someone responded with a joke about how tight spaces make odors travel. No one laughed loudly. They didn't need to. The tone was enough. A flight attendant finally looked toward Delaney, tilted her head slightly, and asked if she needed assistance. Delaney opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, a firm hand came down on the attendant's shoulder. It was the purser, older, neatly composed, eyes tight with barely hidden annoyance. He leaned in and spoke low to the attendant, something clipped and quick. The woman straightened and nodded, then turned back to Delaney and smiled without warmth. "If you could just wait a moment," she said. "We need to allow our premier guest to exit first." Delaney nodded once, too tired to argue, too broken to challenge it. The plane emptied around her, row by row, passenger by passenger. Preston walked past without so much as a glance. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. The others followed, feet tapping the aisle, suitcases bumping elbows and knees, voices rising with renewed energy as they re-entered the world where she had never been invited. And then, for a moment, she was alone. Just her and the humming overhead lights, and the faint smell of fuel outside the sealed doors. The same flight attendant returned, expression reset, and offered to help with her bag. Delaney nodded again. Her voice had retreated too far inside to be useful. As they moved slowly toward the exit, Delaney dragging herself forward with each step, the weight of everything she had endured crashed over her all at once. The assault of Preston's smug face, the way he had spoken to her, the casual cruelty of the passengers, the indifference of the staff, the endless, cold ritual of being made invisible and yet somehow constantly judged. When she reached the front galley, a flight attendant offered her a paper voucher for an apology beverage. It was folded in half, impersonal, bureaucratic, the kind of gesture that felt like a slap disguised as a gift. She didn't take it. She walked down the jet bridge, legs throbbing, head high. She made her way into the terminal, the crowd parting slightly as she passed, not out of respect, but because her pace was slow and deliberate, and people didn't want to be slowed down. She walked until she reached a quiet corner near the large floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the tarmac. She dropped her bag beside her and sat slowly on a metal bench. Her reflection glared back at her in the glass. It was the natural continuation of the treatment she had endured since stepping onto the plane hours ago. She was not seen, not truly. She had been observed, judged, ridiculed, and insulted. But she had not been seen. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, something within her had begun to stir. It was not rage. It was not pain. It was not even the hunger for revenge. It was clarity, a strange and quiet certainty that something had shifted, not around her, but within her. She had reached her threshold, not of suffering, but of silence. She glanced down at her phone, which had remained in her bag since the flight began. She unlocked it and saw the notifications waiting like a swarm, emails, texts, calendar alerts. She scrolled slowly, her thumb hovering over a familiar name in her inbox. Messages marked urgent, follow-ups flagged with red exclamation marks, meeting invites for the next 3 days stacked against one another. Her name sat proudly in every header. Dr. Delaney Rucker, Chief Director of Biotechnical Research at Northwind Allen Laboratories. She stared at the signature in one of the emails, her own title staring back at her like a stranger. She remembered the early mornings, the sleepless nights, the endless clinical trials, the mountains of peer-reviewed studies she had led. She remembered the conference where she stood alone before a crowd of industry giants, mostly older, mostly male, mostly white, and presented data that redefined the framework of protein synthesis therapy in autoimmune patients. She remembered the applause. She remembered the recognition. She remembered the call from the Department of Health requesting a private consultation that led to a government advisory position. And she remembered every single moment in the last 6 hours where she had been treated like a burden, a parasite, a charity case unworthy of basic dignity. Not once had she mentioned her name. Not once had she corrected them. Not when they questioned her ticket. Not when they bumped her from first class. Not when they laughed at her, spilled on her, ignored her. She had let them believe what they wanted to believe. Because her name had not been the armor she wore. It had been the secret she protected. But now, as she sat in that terminal wrapped in the stench of dried soda and the sour memory of prejudice, she realized it was time to stop protecting that secret. It was time to let the truth rise. Slowly she stood. Her body ached, her ankles swelled, and her shoulders rolled back stiffly. She moved toward the row of check-in counters ahead, where airline representatives were stationed behind polished podiums. A line had formed, mostly passengers from other flights, but Delaney walked past them without pause. One of the staff members, a young man with a crisp uniform and tired eyes, looked up and opened his mouth to object, but she stopped in front of him and spoke before he could. She introduced herself plainly. Her voice was soft but firm. She requested to speak with the station manager. She did not explain why. She did not justify herself. She simply stood and waited. The attendant blinked once, then again, and nodded. 5 minutes later, the manager arrived, a woman with a tight bun, a sharp blazer, and a name tag that read Cunningham. She approached with the smooth professionalism of someone trained to extinguish complaints before they flared. She smiled. She asked how she could help. Delaney asked to speak somewhere private. Again, her voice was calm. It held no anger, but something in it was unmoving. The manager hesitated, then led her to a small office behind the counter. Inside, Delaney sat. The manager remained standing, and then Delaney began to speak. She described everything from the beginning. The moment she boarded, the look from the man in 2B, the refusal to move his coat, the lie about the system glitch, the reassignment to economy, the drink, the laughter, the passengers who mocked her, the crew who ignored her, the insults spoken in whispers and silence, the deliberate act of Preston Vance bumping her, the warning she received instead, the forced delay in deplaning, the voucher offered like a bandage over a bullet wound. The manager's face changed slowly as she listened. The professional smile faded. Her eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a line. She asked Delaney if she had any identification. Delaney handed her a business card. The manager read the name, the title, the affiliations. Her eyes widened slightly. Then, delicately, she asked if Delaney was related to the Northwind Allen biotech firm. Delaney replied that she was not only connected, but the lead executive for their research division and the primary signature on the $2.6 billion partnership agreement signed last quarter with the airline's parent investment group. Silence fell between them like a dropped weight. The manager blinked. She asked Delaney to repeat it. Delaney did. She provided the name of the executive at the investment group. The manager recognized it immediately. She asked if Delaney wished to file a report. Delaney said she would be filing much more than that. She said she would be initiating a formal incident review not only with the airline, but through every executive channel she held influence over. And more than that, she would make a call. Not to threaten, not to punish, but to inform. Because the truth deserved daylight. The manager's posture shifted. She apologized again and again, offering vouchers, accommodations, a private car. Delaney declined each offer. She rose from her seat, straightened her dress as much as she could, and walked out of the office without another word. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A message from her assistant. Her presence, her name, her title had already begun to echo into the spaces that had tried to erase her. What she carried now was larger than her appearance. It was the weight of truth, and truth traveled farther than whispers. She approached the car service kiosk, confirmed her identity, and was guided to a black sedan already waiting at the curb. As the driver opened the rear door and stepped aside, Delaney slid in slowly, her body protesting, but her mind sharp. The city lights shimmered across the car's tinted windows as the vehicle pulled away from the terminal. In the soft leather interior, Delaney pulled out her phone again. Her thumb scrolled through contact names with deliberate focus until she landed on the one that mattered most, Emery Keene, chairman of Northwind Allen's executive board and lead signatory on the airline's investment oversight deal. She pressed the name and waited. The call connected on the second ring. His voice, deep and polished, answered with a greeting marked by habit and authority. Delaney didn't hesitate. She gave him the short version. She described the flight, the removal, the humiliation, the silence. She named Preston Vance. She described the behavior of the crew. She did not raise her voice. She did not embellish. She laid it out with clinical precision, the same way she had once presented groundbreaking research before global health councils. Emery listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked if she intended to proceed with filing a formal incident report. Delaney said she already had. But she was calling him not just to report what had occurred. She was calling to advise that her team would be reviewing the investment structure between Northwind Allen and the airline's parent company. She made clear that she no longer had confidence in any public-facing partnership tied to a system that allowed this kind of treatment to occur without intervention. She said she would be releasing a private memo to all division heads advising a pause in collaboration until a thorough accountability review was completed. Emery fell quiet for several seconds. Then, with an edge of sincerity rarely heard from him, he said he understood. He said the board would be briefed immediately. He asked if she was all right. Delaney replied that she was tired, but fine. Then she ended the call. Her hands were steady now. She felt it in her bones, the quiet shift, the way the air felt different now that she had spoken, not as a victim, but as a force. Her silence had preserved her dignity during the flight, but her voice had become the tool that would expose what others wanted to keep hidden. Back at the airport, inside the regional office, the manager to whom she had spoken scrambled to relay the conversation she had just had with Dr. Rucker to her own supervisors. Emails flew. Calls were made. Names were checked and rechecked. Preston Vance's name rose quickly among them, triggering a cross-reference to the manifest and his frequent flyer account, tied to his role as a private sector consultant and board affiliate for the airline's elite loyalty program. Within hours, his name would appear in an incident file flagged for internal review, not just because of his behavior, but because of who his target had been. Corporate risk assessment teams were alerted. Human Resources flagged the crew roster from the flight. A compliance officer drafted a memo. No one moved with panic. They moved with fear, the kind born not from guilt, but from the realization that they had offended someone whose voice had reach, whose decisions shaped financial futures, whose silence had always been mistaken for insignificance. As Delaney's car pulled up to the entrance of her downtown hotel, she stepped out slowly, thanked the driver, and entered the quiet lobby where the receptionist recognized her by name and offered a sweet key with genuine courtesy. Delaney nodded and accepted it without comment. Upstairs, she moved through the spacious room, dropping her bag by the door, removing her shoes, and walking barefoot to the window that overlooked the city skyline. She stood there for several minutes, one hand resting over her belly, her thoughts slow and steady. Her assistant had already sent her a follow-up text confirming that the board's finance committee had entered a closed-door session. The deal was being reviewed. Emails requesting clarification on her position were piling up. She would respond to them, but not tonight. Tonight, she needed rest. But as she closed the curtains and turned toward the bed, another message came through. It was short, a name she didn't recognize. An internal manager copied on the airline's compliance report. The message included an apology, a direct one, personal. The first she had received all day that didn't come from obligation or fear. She paused, reread it, and saved it without replying. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Preston Vance checked into his hotel unaware of the chain of consequences already moving against him. He had laughed about the flight with colleagues during drinks. He had shared an embellished story about an entitled woman demanding a seat she didn't deserve. He called her dramatic. He made her the villain. But now, his name appeared in internal alerts labeled red for priority. Meetings were scheduled for the next morning. His conduct would be reviewed. He would be asked to explain his actions. He would be informed of the woman's identity. She looked up briefly, her expression tight, and pointed toward the conference room at the end of the hall. Preston walked forward, puzzled but not alarmed. As he stepped through the doorway, he found himself face to face with three individuals seated at the long glass table: legal counsel, corporate compliance, and the regional director of operations. Each had folders open in front of them. Each had expressions that had been carefully composed but could not hide the tension beneath. Preston paused. The director gestured to the seat across from her. He sat slowly, still unsure what this was. Then they began. Calmly, factually, professionally, they laid out the incident report filed the previous night. They stated that an executive-level passenger, credentialed and verified, had been forcibly displaced from her first-class seat without procedural cause. They referenced crew interviews, passenger statements, and cabin logs. Then came the name, Delaney Rucker. Preston's eyes twitched only slightly, but enough. He remembered. The woman, the seat, the dismissal, the comments, the bump in the aisle, the smirks, the laughter. He had not known her name. Not then. He had not cared. Now it hung in the air like a hammer. The director went on to explain the implications of Dr. Rucker's position, her affiliations, her financial oversight of $1 billion partnership in which Preston's own firm held indirect equity, her pending formal complaint filed through not just customer service, but with the Federal Transportation Oversight Committee and a legal review board responsible for ethical standards in corporate hospitality. Preston swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He attempted to speak, to explain, but they cut him off with a hand raised in preemptive dismissal. They were not here for his version of events. They were here to inform him of next steps. Effective immediately, his access to elite loyalty privileges was suspended. An independent audit had been commissioned regarding his behavior on all recent flights involving preferred passenger disputes. The airline's public relations team had been briefed. His name had been flagged internally for reputational risk. Preston leaned back slightly, stunned. He was not being asked to resign, not yet. But the subtext was clear. This was the beginning of the unraveling. Every advantage he had coasted on, status, reputation, assumption of harmless power, was now under review. All because of a woman he had chosen to humiliate without knowing who she was. Or worse, without thinking it would matter. Hours later, across the city, inside the airline's headquarters, the crew from the flight had been summoned one by one. Not shouted at, not fired on the spot, but questioned carefully. Their statements dissected, their decisions picked apart. The flight attendant who had ignored Delaney's request for water shifted nervously as the investigator replayed timestamps. The purser who had forced her to wait during disembarkation offered stiff excuses. But the silence spoke louder than their defenses. They had failed to follow protocol. They had allowed a passenger's treatment to be shaped by prejudice, passivity, and false politeness. The review board took notes. The union representative remained stone-faced. Warnings were issued. Mandatory retraining ordered. One staff member was suspended pending a deeper ethics review. But the damage had already spread. Word had leaked internally. Executives spoke in hushed tones. Legal staff were consulted. Brand managers reviewed customer-facing materials for statements of diversity, inclusion, respect. Every slogan suddenly felt hollow. Every training session suddenly inadequate. In the midst of it all, Delaney's name remained at the center. Not because she had demanded it, but because it could no longer be ignored. Her memo to Northwind Allen's board had been concise. Not angry, not dramatic, but pointed. Her final paragraph stated clearly that the company could not continue partnerships with organizations that tolerated systemic disrespect, especially when directed at women of color. It struck like a bell in a quiet room. Board members who had previously dismissed ethics clauses as symbolic now found themselves rereading them. Department heads whispered about contingency plans. Investor relations sent draft statements to public affairs. Delaney had made no public comment. Not yet. But the threat of her voice was enough. And still, she remained composed. From her hotel suite, she reviewed documents, responded to emails, and conducted her meetings with the same discipline she always had. She did not gloat. She did not post. She simply led. That quiet strength sent tremors through the structures that had tried to reduce her to a footnote. In another city, one of the passengers from a flight, the woman with platinum hair and diamonds, received a discreet letter from the airline notifying her that a complaint had been filed regarding her in-flight behavior. While the airline would not take punitive action, it advised her that such conduct might result in future restrictions. She scoffed at the letter, tossed it, but she did not joke about it to her friends. Not this time. Something about it lingered. Something about knowing that the woman she had mocked had turned out to be someone whose silence carried more weight than their laughter. The jokes no longer felt safe. Elsewhere, the man who had sprayed sanitizer after looking at Delaney's seat read the news about the suspended flight crew and the pending review. He recognized the timing. He remembered the spill. He remembered how he hadn't spoken up. He said nothing now, but the shame sat in his chest like a hot coin. The teenage boy who had looked away on the plane thought about the woman with the soaked dress and the silent strength. He searched her name and found the press release from a year ago, the awards, the research, the keynote speech she had given about healthcare access for underserved communities. He remembered his silence. He wondered if she had seen him hesitate. The world around them had begun to shift, not from outrage, but from consequence, not from spectacle, but from accountability. The airline stock took a modest dip after news of the investigation leaked. Articles speculated about ethics compliance and corporate image. Preston's name did not appear in print, not yet, but in the internal database that tracked VIP clients, his profile was now tagged yellow, a cautionary designation reserved for those with unresolved conduct matters. His upcoming travel was downgraded. He noticed it immediately. And though no one confronted him directly, he felt the change in tone when speaking to assistants, to flight personnel, to associates who now returned calls slower than before. In private, he blamed political correctness. Preston Vance stood at the far end of the boardroom, the familiar comfort of command no longer present in the room that had once responded instinctively to his voice. The long table that had once felt like a stage now resembled a courtroom. The seats were filled with colleagues, partners, and compliance monitors, and though no gavel had sounded, judgment was already in motion. He had not lost his position, not yet, but the privileges that had shadowed his every step, the private lounges, the deferential greetings, the automatic upgrades, the unchecked assumptions, had begun to crumble beneath the weight of exposure. A new culture had arrived, one that didn't ask what you had built, but whom you had harmed to build it. The silence was heavier now. Preston adjusted his tie, no longer certain whether it gave him polish or served as a noose of his own making. He spoke into the hush, offering an apology crafted carefully, void of legal traps, but heavy with a slow realization that something fundamental within him had been rotten. He said he had misjudged. He said he had acted from a place of arrogance, one he had never been forced to name until now. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not expect it. But he acknowledged that the man who had walked onto that plane had done so with a sense of entitlement that had consumed every ounce of decency he once claimed to value. The words did not redeem him. They did not erase the humiliation he had inflicted, but they echoed. Slowly, his voice cracked, not from rehearsed sorrow, but from something unpracticed and unfamiliar: guilt. Behind the scenes, Delaney Rucker had declined every offer for a public settlement. She had declined interviews, press requests, and corporate statements, with her name pre-inserted beside slogans about learning and growth. She made it clear that she was not interested in being anyone's symbol. She had not fought for attention. She had not acted to punish. Her actions had been deliberate, directed, and principled. Change was never about spotlight. It was about structure. She spent the weeks following the incident not in meetings about herself, but in closed sessions revising policy oversight protocols between her company and its partners. Her input restructured the standards for executive review processes, elevating real consequence above surface-level PR. Training modules were rewritten with her insights. Hiring and conduct procedures were updated with practical accountability measures, not just slide decks and empty pledges. And when she finally sat down to review the final draft of a partnership ethics document, she added one last line beneath the clause about conduct and professionalism. Dignity is not situational. It must be defended when inconvenient, not only when expected. Meanwhile, in the home Preston rarely returned to with presence, his wife read the articles that eventually emerged, not with his name, but with enough detail to stitch the truth together. She confronted him not with anger, but with disbelief. She asked if he had truly believed he could speak to someone that way and remain untouched. Preston did not answer. He didn't need to. Her silence told him that part of his world had shifted too. His children, older and grown, reached out one by one, not to defend him, but to ask how he could change. Not just his actions, his mindset, his history. For the first time, he had no easy reply. In a quiet neighborhood across the city, one of the flight attendants who had served on that flight sat at her kitchen table in the early hours of a Saturday morning. She stared at the coffee mug in her hands, unmoving. She remembered how she had looked at Delaney without seeing her, how she had smiled tightly, how she had avoided eye contact, taken orders from her purser, said nothing when the woman in the navy dress sat soaked and shaking in silence. Her own mother had told her once that silence is permission. That morning, she opened her laptop and began typing a letter. Not to the airline, not to her supervisor, to Delaney. She found a contact address buried in a public faculty profile. She wrote plainly, not for praise, but because it was the first thing she had done with sincerity since that flight landed. In another part of the country, the teenage boy who had sat across from Delaney on that plane began a school presentation about ethics and technology. When asked to give a real-world example of systemic bias, he chose that flight. He did not say Delaney's name, but he described her as he had seen her, the quiet way she endured, the look on her face, the injustice that others found amusing. His classmates listened. Something shifted in them. He saw it. In small ways, the story that had been meant to silence her became the force that opened eyes. Not through outrage, but reflection. Not through spectacle, but humanity. Delaney never met Preston again. Their paths diverged completely after the board's formal review. He remained in the corporate world, but his trajectory flattened. No more keynote appearances. No more automatic access. His name now came with a pause. A question, a footnote, and in that quiet space where once his voice had commanded, now his history whispered. Delaney returned to her work with a deeper resolve. Her child was born weeks later, healthy, strong, eyes wide with curiosity. She named her Micah, after the prophet who reminded the world to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And in the nursery, during the soft hours before dawn, she would sometimes hum to her child not lullabies, but the words she had once whispered to herself during those darkest hours. You belong. You are not invisible. You are not a mistake. You are not silence. You are meaning. Her story did not end in vengeance. It ended in impact. Because power used wisely is not a tool for retribution. It is a hand extended where others once pointed. It is a voice raised not in pride, but in purpose. It is the quiet courage to say no more, and to live as the answer to that declaration. The end. If you found this story powerful, take a second to like and subscribe for more narratives that dive deep into truth, justice, and transformation. What did you think of the twists and how the story unfolded? Did the ending leave an impact? Let us know where you're watching from and how the plot hit you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps shape the next journey.